We were celebrating at an upscale restaurant, enjoying a family dinner, when my daughter-in-law excused herself to take my granddaughter to the restroom. In that moment of solitude, something terrifying happened. An elderly woman appeared out of nowhere, moving with unsettling urgency. She thrust a small crimson pouch into my trembling hands and whispered words that would haunt me forever. "Get a taxi immediately. Take your son and leave this place now. Do this if you don't want him to become the next sacrifice." Terror gripped me as I pulled my son toward the exit. When I finally looked inside the bag, I froze completely. But before I continue what happened next, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the Elderly Stories channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to see how far these stories of courage and survival reach across the world. That particular day had begun like any other ordinary morning in our household. I was preparing breakfast, sliding the last perfectly fried egg onto a plate, when I felt small arms wrap around my waist from behind. "Good morning, Grandma," chirped Sarah, my beloved granddaughter. I turned around with a warm smile and gently stroked her soft hair. Michael, my only son, had just descended the stairs. He leaned in to plant a quick kiss on my cheek, a tender habit he'd maintained since childhood and never abandoned. "Good morning, Mom," he said, though his voice carried an unusual heaviness. I studied him carefully with a mother's instinct. His complexion appeared unnaturally pale, and dark circles shadowed his eyes, betraying numerous sleepless nights. "I haven't been sleeping well lately," he admitted with a weary sigh as he settled into his chair at the breakfast table. Linda, his wife, was the last to join us. As always, she appeared impeccably dressed in an elegant business suit, her hair pulled back in a sophisticated high bun that projected an image of competence and professionalism. She smiled at me, a smile that seemed perfect and cordial on the surface. "Thank you for breakfast, Mom," she said warmly, though she only took a glass of murky green celery juice and sipped it delicately. Then, without warning, she announced with considerable enthusiasm, "Tonight, we're all going out to dinner together as a family. I just closed a major deal with an extremely important client downtown. This calls for a celebration." She explained that she'd already made reservations at a luxurious rooftop restaurant. The way she phrased it felt more like a notification than an invitation, leaving absolutely no room for discussion or refusal. That evening, during the drive to the restaurant, Linda couldn't stop talking enthusiastically about her work at the Energy Recovery Center. She spoke with genuine passion about her clients who had supposedly regained their inner balance and confidence through her meditation and healing therapies. Michael sat behind the wheel, driving in near silence. Occasionally, he would nod in acknowledgement, but through the rearview mirror, I could clearly observe how sunken his eyes had become in a profound exhaustion that seemed to weigh him down. The restaurant occupied the rooftop of a gleaming skyscraper, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the city below, which sparkled like an earthbound galaxy in the darkness. The dinner proceeded pleasantly enough at first. Midway through the meal, Sarah was playing with her napkin when she accidentally knocked over her strawberry juice, spilling across her pristine white dress. Linda released an exasperated sigh. "I'll take her to the restroom to clean her up," she announced, rising from her seat and leading Sarah away. At precisely that moment, Michael's cell phone rang with an insistent tone. He frowned deeply and explained it was an urgent work call. He excused himself and stepped out onto the terrace, seeking some quiet space to handle the matter. I found myself sitting alone at that enormous table, and that's when everything changed. From behind a massive marble column, a woman emerged. She wore old, severely faded clothing that seemed completely out of place in this luxurious setting. But what truly took my breath away was her face. A long, deep scar crossed from her cheek down to her chin, pulling one corner of her mouth upward in a disturbing, permanent grimace. She walked directly toward me without any hesitation whatsoever. Her expression radiated urgency and desperation. Diners at nearby tables began to notice the unusual scene, whispering among themselves. A waiter spotted her and hurried over to intervene. The old woman moved with remarkable speed despite her age. She slipped a small red cloth pouch, old and worn, into my hand beneath the table. Her hand felt icy and skeletal, touching my skin like a frozen branch on a winter day. She leaned toward me and in a harsh, hurried whisper right beside my ear, she spoke words that pierced my comfortable illusions like a knife. "Call a taxi and get your son out of here immediately. Right now. If you don't want him to become the sacrifice." Just then the waiter arrived and asked politely, "Ma'am, is everything all right? Do you need any assistance?" The old woman turned abruptly and moved quickly toward the emergency exit, disappearing into darkness before anyone could react or stop her. I sat frozen in my seat, my heart pounding violently against my ribcage. That ghostly warning echoed endlessly in my mind, refusing to be silenced. Without allowing myself to think or hesitate any longer, I stood up immediately. I told a concerned waiter I wasn't feeling well and rushed outside to find Michael. I discovered him just beyond the entrance. He'd apparently just extinguished a cigarette, and his face looked utterly exhausted under the harsh yellow streetlight. I didn't say a single word of explanation. I simply grabbed his hand tightly and pulled him forcefully toward the parking lot. "Let's go, Michael. Right now." He appeared surprised and somewhat annoyed by my behavior. "Mom, what's wrong? What's happening?" I didn't answer his questions. I simply dragged him toward the parking lot with determination. I practically pushed him into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. Under the cold, flickering fluorescent lights of the parking structure, I opened the mysterious red pouch with trembling hands. Inside was a leather amulet covered with twisted, strange symbols drawn in dark ink that resembled dried blood. I told Michael everything that had just occurred, my voice breaking with genuine fear. He listened, frowning at first with skepticism, but when I finished my account, he actually laughed. His laughter echoed strangely in the concrete silence of the parking structure, sounding alien and wrong. "Oh, Mom, you're really exaggerating," he said, trying to contain his amusement. "That was probably just some clever beggar who invented a new scheme to extract money from people. In these expensive places, people like that sometimes manage to sneak in. You're tired and letting your imagination run wild." He dismissed everything I'd said, completely ignoring all my fears and concerns. He opened the car door with a softer, more conciliatory tone. "Come on, Linda and Sarah are waiting for us upstairs. We need to go back and finish our dessert." I had absolutely no choice but to follow my son back to the restaurant table. Linda and Sarah were already seated there, and my granddaughter was wearing a clean, spare dress from her backpack. Linda asked me kindly if something was troubling me, and I had no option but to lie, claiming I'd felt momentarily dizzy. Throughout the remainder of that dinner, I couldn't swallow another single bite. The intense, disturbing gaze of that scarred old woman and the blood-stained amulet kept circling relentlessly through my thoughts. From that pivotal moment forward, I began to observe everything in careful silence, with growing obsession. The changes in Michael were becoming increasingly evident and impossible to ignore. He was no longer truly my son, but rather like a fading shadow of the person he once was. His memory began to deteriorate noticeably. One afternoon, he spent a full 15 minutes searching frantically for his wallet, even though it sat directly in front of him on the table the entire time. Another day, when I reminded him about his scheduled dentist appointment, he looked at me with genuine confusion and asked what appointment I was referring to. The final straw came when he was discussing his work with me and suddenly couldn't remember the name of Richard, his closest business partner for 5 solid years. He scratched his head in frustration and confusion, then abruptly changed the subject. Sleep ambushed him at the most inappropriate times, like a thief stealing his consciousness and lucidity. He would fall asleep in the middle of dinner, his fork clattering metallically onto his plate as it slipped from his fingers. When he awakened from these micro-sleeps, his eyes appeared dull and lifeless, completely empty. It would take him several seconds, sometimes more than a full minute, to orient himself and remember who he was or where he was. One night, while we were watching television together as a family, something occurred that absolutely froze my blood. The movie had ended. The screen displayed only blackness, and our silhouettes were dimly reflected on the sofa in the television's dark mirror. Suddenly, Michael released a low, unsettling laugh, like a hoarse whisper, a dry laugh completely devoid of genuine joy or humor. He sat staring at that black screen, laughing at nothing. "What are you laughing at, Michael?" I asked, desperately trying to sound calm and casual. He startled visibly and turned toward me with the expression of a surprised child caught doing something forbidden. Huh? What did you say, Mom? He genuinely didn't know what he'd just been doing. He had no awareness or memory of that strange, disturbing laughter. Throughout all of these concerning changes, Linda seemed to be playing the role of the perfect, devoted wife. She constantly expressed her concern for Michael's deteriorating health. Every single night before bedtime, she personally prepared an herbal infusion for him with her own hands. That tea was disturbingly dark, like thick mud, with an earthy smell of roots and damp soil that permeated the entire kitchen. It's an exclusive energy cleansing formula from the center, she explained to me with absolute confidence. It helps him release accumulated negative energy and sleep more peacefully. She adamantly insisted that Michael shouldn't take any other medication whatsoever. When I suggested cautiously one evening, "What if we take Michael to see a proper doctor?" Linda dismissed the idea immediately with a smile that remained on her lips even as her eyes turned icy cold. "Oh, Mom, modern medicine simply doesn't understand energy flow problems," she said condescendingly. "They're only going to prescribe him harmful chemical pills with terrible side effects. Trust me on this. This special tea will help him heal naturally." I felt my throat close completely with suppressed anxiety. How could I possibly argue against logic that I couldn't begin to understand or verify? That night, I experienced a truly horrible nightmare. I dreamed I was inside our own house, but everything had become rotten and decayed, covered entirely in thick cobwebs. The paint peeled from the walls in long strips. The furniture appeared twisted and warped unnaturally. From the floor above, I could hear Michael's weak, broken voice calling out desperately, "Mom, help me. Please help me." I ran toward his room with mounting panic, but the hallway stretched endlessly before me, as if I were trapped on a never-ending treadmill. When I finally reached his door, after what felt like hours, I saw Linda standing with her back toward me. She turned slowly, almost mechanically, and in her hand she held a small knife that gleamed menacingly under the pale moonlight streaming through the window. I woke with a violent start, soaked completely in cold sweat, my heart pounding so hard I felt certain it would burst from my chest. My throat felt painfully dry. I desperately needed a glass of water. I left my bedroom on careful tiptoe. The house was submerged in almost absolute silence, interrupted only by the rhythmic ticking of the pendulum clock in the living room. As I passed my son and daughter-in-law's bedroom, I noticed their door was slightly ajar, leaving a narrow crack of space. I was going to continue straight to the kitchen without pausing, but a sound made me stop dead in my tracks. It was Linda's voice, but she wasn't speaking in English or any language I recognized. Instead, she produced a series of repetitive guttural sounds mixed with strange hisses that I'd never heard before in my entire life. It didn't sound like any human language at all, but rather like some ancient, forbidden incantation. A powerful shiver ran down my spine, but curiosity proved stronger than fear. I held my breath carefully and approached the door, looking cautiously through the narrow crack. A dim, flickering light emanated from inside the room. It came from the flame of a single black candle placed directly on the floor. Under that eerie, dancing light, the scene I witnessed left me completely paralyzed with terror. Linda was kneeling on the floor. She wore a black tunic that covered her entirely from head to toe, making her appear like a shapeless shadow, without human form. In front of her rested a small, dark wooden statue. It possessed a vaguely human shape, but its arms and legs were unnaturally elongated and thin. The most terrifying detail was its head, completely smooth and featureless, without eyes, without a nose, without a mouth. Just an empty, expressionless void where a face should have been. Beside her in their large bed, Michael slept deeply and heavily. He lay flat on his back with his arms positioned at his sides, motionless as a log, completely unaware of the macabre ritual occurring just steps away from him. A strong, deeply unpleasant smell slipped through the crack in the door, assaulting my nose. It combined the acrid stench of burnt wax with a faint metallic odor underneath, unmistakably the smell of blood. I backed away immediately, covering my mouth tightly with both hands to contain the scream that threatened to tear from my chest. I took one step backward, then another, being extremely careful not to make even the slightest noise. The wooden floorboard creaked beneath my weight, as if it wanted to betray my presence. I turned and practically ran back to my room, like a fugitive escaping capture. I locked the door behind me, trembling violently. The sharp click of the lock resonated dryly in the middle of that silent night. I curled up in my bed, pulling the covers over my head, until the first pale rays of dawn finally filtered through my window. I couldn't sleep anymore after what I'd witnessed. Linda's sinister whispers and the disturbing image of that faceless statue kept drilling relentlessly into my mind. All the scattered, confusing pieces suddenly fit together into one complete and gruesome picture. I knew it now with absolute certainty. The old woman's desperate warning in that restaurant had not been the delusional ravings of a mentally ill beggar. It was completely, terrifyingly true. The next morning, I descended to the kitchen with legs that felt heavy as lead, attempting to start a new day as if nothing whatsoever had happened. My hand trembled slightly as I set the plate of scrambled eggs on the breakfast table, but I hoped desperately that no one would notice. Linda came down the stairs looking strangely radiant, almost glowing with inner light. Her vibrant energy contrasted completely and disturbingly with my son's visible decay. She hummed a cheerful melody under her breath, and then turned to me with a voice dripping with sweetness. "Mom, did you sleep well last night?" I nodded my head without daring to look her directly in the eyes, fearing she might somehow read the horror and disgust I felt burning inside me. Michael came downstairs next, staggering like a sleepwalker, with dark circles that had now turned a deep, alarming purple shade. He let himself fall heavily onto his chair and rested his head directly on the table, his hair all disheveled and messy. "I'm so tired," he muttered in a hoarse, barely audible voice. Linda went to him immediately, wrapping her arm around his shoulders and caressing his back with exaggerated tenderness. "Drink this, my love," she told him in a low, soothing voice, pushing the glass of murky herbal tea toward him. "You'll feel so much better right away." The way she looked at him wasn't the expression of a genuinely worried wife, but rather that of someone carefully evaluating a possession or a prize. I realized in that moment that I had to act immediately, right now. "I'm not feeling well today," I announced, feigning tiredness in my voice. "My knees are hurting quite badly. It must be because of the weather changing. I think I'm going to stay home and rest instead of visiting my friend Susan, as I'd originally planned." Linda turned to look at me, and in her eyes flashed something difficult to decipher. Perhaps relief, perhaps suspicion. "Really? Well, rest well, Mom. Don't overexert yourself unnecessarily." Her concern appeared perfect in every single detail, but I knew that deep down she was celebrating my decision. My carefully constructed plan had successfully begun. I positioned myself on the living room sofa, pretending to read an old, well-worn novel, but my mind and ears remained tense as a tightly wound violin string, alert and attentive to every single noise in the house. First came the sound of Michael starting his car, the engine sounding weak and struggling as it pulled away, taking with it another piece of my son's fading soul. Approximately an hour later, I heard Linda upstairs encouraging Sarah with artificial cheerfulness. "Hurry up, my love. We're going to be late for school if we don't leave right now." Then came the hurried little footsteps of my granddaughter rushing down the stairs, followed by the front door slamming shut with finality. I ran to the window and lifted the curtain slightly, just enough to peek outside. I stood absolutely motionless, holding my breath and waiting with mounting tension until Linda's distinctive silver car disappeared completely at the end of our street. The house now belonged only to me. Silence covered everything like a suffocating blanket, but it wasn't a peaceful, comfortable silence. It was a heavy silence of horrible secrets, the silence of a predator holding its breath before striking. I took a deep, steadying breath to fill myself with courage and began climbing the stairs. My hand rested on the wooden handrail for support. I felt as though my bones might fail me at any moment. Every step upward felt like a tremendous burden, taking me closer and closer to a truth that perhaps I didn't truly want to face. I stood in front of my son and daughter-in-law's bedroom door, hesitating for just a second. Guilt invaded my consciousness, the guilt of someone violating another person's privacy. But then the haunting image of Michael exhausted and soulless, combined with Linda's strange whispers in the night, pushed me forward. I had absolutely no choice anymore. I pushed the door open and entered their private space. The room appeared tidy to a point that actually gave me chills. The sheets were folded perfectly, without a single wrinkle. On the wall hung a huge framed photograph from their wedding day. My Michael in that image looked so incredibly happy, with eyes full of pure joy and genuine hope. Linda's radiant smile beside him now stabbed into me like a shard of glass. I began searching methodically. I opened their closet, carefully rummaging through Linda's expensive designer clothes. I checked every single drawer in their dresser. I examined under the papers scattered across her desk. Nothing seemed obviously out of place at first glance. There were only bills, business contracts, and numerous books about positive energy and spiritual healing. But my mother's instinct whispered insistently that something was hidden here. I knelt down on the floor and peered into the dark space beneath their bed. At first, I saw only accumulated dust and some old shoe boxes pushed against the wall. But looking more closely at the deepest, darkest corner against the back wall, I noticed something else, a darker shape that didn't belong. I threw myself flat on the cold floor, stretching my arm as far as I possibly could, and finally my trembling fingers managed to touch it. I pulled it out into the light. It was a dark, antique wooden box with surface worn smooth by the passage of considerable time. It had no padlock securing it, just a simple bronze latch that had already blackened with age. My hands were shaking so violently I could almost not manage to open it. Finally, after several attempts, it came loose. The lid opened with a soft creak and revealed what lay hidden inside. Everything was arranged exactly as I had suspected and feared in my worst imaginings. First, I saw the faceless statue carefully wrapped in a piece of black velvet cloth. When I removed the protective fabric, a distinctly cold air seemed to emanate from the object. Its wooden body felt smooth and icy to the touch, so unnaturally cold it sent immediate chills to my entire body. That empty head seemed to look directly at me despite having no eyes, sucking away the last remnants of my courage. Next to it lay a red cloth amulet. It was absolutely identical to the one the scarred old woman had thrust into my hands at the restaurant, only this one appeared slightly newer and less worn. I took the other amulet out of my pocket to compare them side by side. They were alike as two drops of water, from the worn fabric to the strange, disturbing symbols drawn with dark ink. Beside that, there was a black candle with only half of it remaining. The melted wax had run all over the tin base in thick drips, but around the base were reddish-brown stains, dry and brittle. I knew instinctively that wasn't wax at all. It was dried blood, and at the very bottom of the box lay a leather notebook without any title. I turned the yellowish pages with increasing dread. They were filled with handwritten letters in a type of writing I couldn't decipher, mixed with elaborate drawings of five-pointed stars, crescent moons, and stick figures positioned in strange, unnatural postures as part of some occult ritual. And then I saw it, the sight that made my blood run cold. The name Michael Johnson was written over and over again, page after page, like a curse, like a death sentence written in ink. Next to his name appeared various dates and mysterious symbols I couldn't begin to understand. I flipped back quickly to the first pages of the notebook and saw other names, all unknown to me, all presumably other victims. But every single one of those names was crossed out with a brutal, thick red line. I didn't cry in that moment. The overwhelming fear had hardened inside me, transforming into cold, absolute determination. Tears would be completely useless right now. I took out my cell phone with shaking hands and carefully placed each disturbing object on the light-colored carpet of the bedroom floor, so they would stand out clearly. I took photographs from multiple angles, making sure to capture everything. I zoomed in closely on the symbols in the notebook, on the page displaying Michael's name repeatedly, on the dried blood stain coating the candle's base. I made absolutely certain all images came out sharp and clear, without losing a single crucial detail. When I finished documenting everything, I put all the objects back very carefully in the box, arranging them exactly in the same positions where I'd found them. I pushed the box back to its dark corner under the bed, erasing every possible trace of my presence. I left their bedroom and closed the door softly behind me, my heart still racing. I had proof now, concrete photographic evidence. Now I just need to find someone who would actually believe this proof. Someone who wouldn't laugh directly in my face thinking I was just a crazy, paranoid old woman. That same afternoon I gathered all my remaining courage and knocked gently on my son's door. He was lying on his bed with his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling as if hypnotized. I sat carefully on the edge of his bed. My trembling hand rested on his shoulder. "Michael," I started with a hoarse, emotional voice. "Don't you feel that something fundamental in you has changed? Don't you feel different somehow? Or maybe you feel that your wife—" I didn't manage to finish my sentence. Suddenly, he sat up abruptly, pushing my hand away with a sharp, rejecting slap. For the very first time in his entire life, he actually yelled at me. His normally gentle eyes shone with a fury I didn't recognize as belonging to my son. "Enough, Mom," he shouted with genuine anger. "Are you still obsessed with that crazy beggar woman? Linda is taking excellent care of me. Can't you see that? She worries about me constantly and does everything for me. Stop suspecting her things." Then he turned around abruptly and stared at the wall, his back hunched defensively like a hedgehog protecting itself. An invisible wall rose between the two of us in that moment. I sat there paralyzed, feeling failure seeping into my bones like poison. I had already lost my son to whatever dark influence controlled him. He didn't trust me anymore. Linda had him completely manipulated and under her control. I alone by myself could never save him. The next morning, I woke up with feeling so suffocating I genuinely couldn't breathe properly. I desperately needed to get out of that house. I needed fresh air. I needed to see the sun and the faces of strangers who had nothing to do with this nightmare. I took my shopping bag and told Linda I was in a farmer's market, the busiest, most crowded market in the city center, to buy some spices and fresh vegetables. She simply nodded without asking any further questions, as if even my very presence in the house somehow bothered her. The noise and chaos of the market helped me calm down somewhat. The loud shouts of the vendors, the haggling of customers, the wonderful aroma of ripe fruits and fresh herbs provided relief, even if only slightly, from the terrible fear that was eating me alive from the inside. I tried to lose myself among the crowds of people, letting the external chaos drown out the chaos raging inside my mind. While I was carefully choosing a bunch of fresh cilantro, I glanced distractedly toward the other side of the street, which was filled with heavy traffic. My eyes stopped unintentionally on a small, old-fashioned pharmacy across the way. A woman had just emerged from that pharmacy. She wore an old, faded robe and a worn scarf that covered almost all of her gray hair. She walked with a hunched posture, as if carrying an invisible weight on her shoulders. She kept her head down, moving hurriedly, clearly tried to blend into the crowd and dodge any direct gazes. A strange feeling of confused familiarity invaded me, and then a small child ran directly in front of her. The woman turned her face slightly to avoid colliding with him. In that brief, fleeting instant, the bright morning light illuminated her face clearly. I stood completely paralyzed, my entire body tense like a coiled spring. The scar, that long, distinctive scar marked from her cheekbone down to her chin, deformed and absolutely unmistakable. It was her, the mysterious woman from the restaurant. My heart seemed to stop beating for a full second, and then it started pounding frantically, so powerfully I could hear it rumbling in my ears. Hope, fear, and absolute urgency all lit up inside me simultaneously. I didn't think about anything else. I dropped the cilantro I'd been holding in my hand. My shopping bag slid off my shoulder and hit the ground. Several ripe tomatoes rolled down the sidewalk and were immediately crushed by people's hurried, careless steps. I didn't care about any of that. I ran across the busy street, completely ignoring the cars passing dangerously close to me. I heard angry honks behind me, the screech of brakes. I heard nothing else clearly. I saw only one thing, the hunchback of that woman moving away from me. I caught up with her just as she turned into a narrower, less traveled side street. "Ma'am, please wait," I shouted with a broken, desperate voice. I reached out and grabbed the worn sleeve of her coat tightly, refusing to let go. She jumped in surprise and turned around suddenly, almost violently. Her eyes displayed absolute panic, like a cornered wild animal facing a predator. She tried desperately to break free, her voice trembling and barely audible. "You're mistaking me for someone else. Please let me go right now." "No, I'm not mistaken," I told her more loudly, though my voice remained low and almost pleading, afraid she would simply disappear again before I could get answers. "It's me, the woman from the restaurant. My son. What you said to me, everything was completely true. Please, I desperately need your help. I need to understand why this is happening." The woman stood absolutely still for a long moment. The fear in her expression gradually gave way to doubt, and then to a painful recognition of shared suffering. She looked directly into my eyes, which were filling with tears, and perhaps she saw in them a desperation so authentic and raw that it simply could not be feigned. She looked around nervously with obvious suspicion, as if an enemy could appear at any moment to stop her. She said nothing more in that public space. Instead, she took me firmly by the arm and pulled me along, but not toward the main street. She led me toward a narrow, dark alley wedged tightly between two old buildings. The overwhelming smell of dampness and rotting trash hit my nose immediately, but I didn't care about the unpleasant conditions. She was taking me somewhere safe where we could finally talk. The alley led us to the back of another street entirely. She stopped abruptly in front of a cafeteria that looked severely neglected, with a worn wooden door and a thick curtain completely covering the window, isolating the interior from all the noise of the outside world. She looked at me with a voice still dry from suppressed emotion and said quietly, "Come inside here. No one is going to pay any attention to us in this place." The old woman pushed open the heavy wooden door, and a rusty bell hanging above it rang with a dry, lonely timbre. Inside the cafe, darkness wrapped everything in its embrace, with thick air that smelled of coffee roasted until almost burnt, mixed with the strong, stale smell of tobacco smoke. That place seemed to exist completely outside the normal outside world, like a hidden refuge for tired, broken souls. There were only a couple of elderly men inside, absorbed completely in a chess game, immersed in their own private world, without even looking up when we entered. The owner, sporting a thick mustache, stood behind the bar. He barely acknowledged us with a slight nod before returning to cleaning a glass with visible reluctance. The old woman led me directly to the most hidden table in the far corner, positioned behind a large support column from where we could see the entire establishment without anyone easily noticing our presence. She sat down in front of me, instinctively choosing a position with her back to the door, as if this were part of an old, ingrained habit of constant surveillance. "A black coffee without sugar," she told the approaching waiter. I was too confused and nervous, with a throat so dry I could barely murmur. "A glass of water, please." The waiter brought our drinks and left immediately without any small talk. The old woman held the hot coffee cup between her hands. The rising steam wrapped around her weathered face like a ghostly mist, partially hiding her scarred features. She didn't drink immediately. She just remained in complete silence, with those deep, haunted eyes fixed intently on me. In her look, I could see not only fear hardened by time, but also contained fury and infinite sadness, the profound sadness of someone who has lost the most valuable thing in their entire life. I didn't dare interrupt her silence. I knew instinctively that she was fighting internal ghosts of the past, deciding whether she should open a wound that had never properly closed. I stayed quiet, with my hands clasped tightly on the table, waiting patiently. Finally, she set the cup down on the saucer with a dry clack that broke the heavy silence. She spoke with a low voice, as if she had been keeping what she was about to reveal locked inside for far too long. "I swore to my granddaughter's soul that I would never speak of this again to anyone," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "But if your son is about to become the next victim, then keeping quiet any longer would be a crime against humanity." She took a deep, steadying breath. "My name is Mrs. Higgins." And then she began to tell her story. The memories poured out like water from a broken dam, unstoppable. Her granddaughter Mary had been an orphan since she was very young, and was raised solely by her grandmother. Mary used to be such a happy, bright girl, radiant as the sun itself. But after experiencing a particularly painful romantic breakup, she fell into a deep, debilitating depression. The light in her beautiful eyes went out completely. That was when Mary discovered Linda's Energy Center through an internet advertisement. That place promised such sweet, enticing things, healing the deepest wounds of the female soul, regaining inner balance with meditation and energy connection therapies. For a broken soul like Mary's, that seemed like a lifesaver thrown to a drowning person. Mrs. Higgins described how Mary started to change drastically after joining the center. She became increasingly mysterious and distant from her grandmother. She no longer shared anything personal with her. She met constantly with new friends from the center, women with strange, somehow empty looks in their eyes. She started talking about things Mrs. Higgins couldn't begin to understand, about an entity called the Silent Mother, and about the urgent need to purify one's soul through sacrifice. She told me about the cult called the Devotees of Silence. It wasn't a true, legitimate religion at all, but rather a kind of dark cult, an ancestral heresy that Linda, who called herself a supreme nun, had reinvented, mixing together wild and cruel beliefs from various sources. Mrs. Higgins' voice broke with raw emotion when she mentioned the most frightening rule of the entire cult. To reach ascension and gain greater power within the group, members had to offer the soul of the person they loved most in the world. They genuinely believed, she whispered in horror, that the greater the personal sacrifice, the greater the blessing they would receive. I felt my blood freeze in my veins. This couldn't be real, but it was. One night, Mary returned home and begged her grandmother to accompany her to a special ceremony at the center, a ceremony specifically to honor mothers and grandmothers. Mrs. Higgins, out of the tremendous love she had for her only granddaughter and wanting desperately to reconnect with her, accepted the invitation without suspecting anything sinister. But Mary didn't take her grandmother to the center in the city as expected. Instead, the young woman drove to an old, secluded farm on the outskirts of town. Inside that abandoned structure, dozens of people dressed in black robes stood in a circle, chanting songs under the eerie, flickering light of numerous candles. And in the very middle of that circle stood Linda with a cold, completely expressionless face illuminated by the fire. Mrs. Higgins realized immediately that she had been tricked, lured into a trap.